Chapter 2. Tantua. The jungle thinned as Henrik and Karas pressed on, leaving the town of Kybase far behind. Henrik could still feel the weight of the conversations at the tavern, the skepticism of the archer, the sidelong glances and the low murmurs that spread like wildfire when Karas had spoken of dwarves. He had always heard the legends, but the road ahead was beginning to feel more real and more dangerous than he had imagined. "Stay close," Karas muttered. The wizard's weathered face, partially obscured by his unruly silver hair, was set with grim determination. He tapped his staff lightly against the ground as they walked, a sound that seemed to resonate through the air like a low hum. The deeper they moved into the wilderness, the more otherworldly the surroundings felt. Henrik glanced over his shoulder at the dark canopy behind them, where his 4 fellow warriors of Kipt had remained. His trusted companions, each capable and hardened by years of battle, had been left to guard their supplies at Karas's insistence. Henrik wasn't sure if he trusted the wizard entirely, but something about the old man's intensity compelled him to follow. "You're certain this is the way?" Henrik asked, his voice low but firm. Karas offered a dry chuckle. "You doubt me, lad?" Henrik smirked but said nothing more. The path ahead of them was rugged and steep, the air thick with the scent of moss and rain-soaked earth. Around them, the jungle was alive with the sounds of birds and distant animals. But there was an eerie stillness closer to the ground, almost as if the forest itself were holding its breath as they approached the mountain. Ahead, the towering figure of Tantua Mountain loomed larger than life. Its peaks seemed to pierce the clouds, shrouded in mist and shadow. It was far more imposing up close than Henrik had expected. The sheer cliffs looked like jagged teeth, and the narrow, winding path they now traveled was bordered by drops that plummeted into unseen depths. "People say no one lives in the mountain," Henrik said, trying to gauge Karas's reaction. "People say many things," Karas replied. His voice was distant, his attention clearly focused on something further ahead. "Most have no idea what truly exists beyond their little worlds. This mountain has seen more than they could ever imagine." Henrik frowned. "What about Jesse? He doesn't seem like the type who would mix with dwarves, let alone get involved in anything this secretive." Karas's lips curled into a knowing grin. "Ah, Jesse, you'd be surprised. The quiet ones always seem to know more than they let on." Henrik arched an eyebrow. "So you've known him a while?" The wizard stopped in his tracks, his staff lightly tapping the ground as he did. He motioned to a stone outcropping by the trail. "Come, sit for a moment. Let me tell you about the first time I met Jesse. It wasn't in a tavern, but deep in this very jungle." The sound of a distant waterfall echoed off the cliffs as Henrik took a seat. The air had grown cooler, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the dense canopy. Karas sat beside him, his fiery brown eyes narrowing as if recalling a distant memory. Jesse was no more than a woodsman back then, or so it seemed. He lived alone, just past the riverbank. One evening, while traveling through these parts, I found myself lost in the thick of the jungle. This place can be disorienting at times, especially when the mist rolls in. He paused for a moment, gazing at the path ahead. That's when I stumbled upon Jesse's camp. At first glance, he looked like nothing more than a giant of a man chopping wood for his fire. Henrik leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "But you knew he was more than just a woodsman?" Karas chuckled softly. "Aye, I could tell there was something about him. He was skilled, no doubt, but there was a presence, a calmness in the way he moved. His hands, large as they are, worked delicately, shaping wood like a master craftsman. But it wasn't the woodwork that caught my attention. It was the runes." Henrik blinked, surprised. "Runes? Jesse?" Karas nodded slowly. Aye, I noticed them etched into his tools, faint markings that only a trained eye could see. Osirisan runes, powerful ones at that. He was no ordinary woodsman, and I could tell he'd been around magic long enough to know how to handle it. Henrik frowned. But how did a man like Jesse get involved with magic? And dwarves, for that matter? Chorus tapped his staff lightly on the ground, the sound echoing in the still air. That's where it gets interesting. You see, Jesse doesn't talk much, but when I mentioned the runes, he opened up a little. Told me he'd once worked with a group of dwarves, craftsmen from Tantua. They'd come down from the mountain to trade supplies, mostly for wood and other materials. In exchange, they taught him how to inscribe basic runes. Useful things, protective wards, minor enchantments for tools. Henrik's interest piqued. So he's connected to them? Connected? Perhaps more than even he knows, Kara said thoughtfully. He's always been cautious about discussing the details, but I got the sense that he earned the dwarves' respect. They don't often teach outsiders their ways, but Jesse must have impressed them. Henrik smirked. Jesse doesn't strike me as the type to impress anyone with words. Koras chuckled, his voice low. No, he doesn't, but actions speak louder in places like this. The dwarves value skill, and Jesse's ability to craft, combined with his quiet strength, earned him a rare place among them. He's made things for them, specialized tools, even weapons. They trust him, in their own way. Henrik nodded, absorbing the story. That's why you asked him to come with us. Precisely, Kara said, his gaze growing distant. The dwarves of Tantua can be difficult to deal with. They respect strength, skill, and loyalty. Jesse has all three, and they know him well enough to listen. He may not say much, but his presence alone could help ease our way into the mountain. Henrik thought about it for a moment, then asked, And how does this all tie into what we're doing here? Why would Jesse leave his quiet life for this? Karas's eyes gleamed. Because he understands the weight of what's happening. The unkind are not just a threat to men or dwarves. They're a threat to everything in these lands. Jesse may be quiet, but he knows when something needs to be done. He's here because he believes, as we do, that the dwarves may be our only hope. Henrik sat in silence for a moment, gazing up at the towering mountain before them. The air seemed heavier now, as if the weight of the journey ahead was settling on his shoulders. I suppose that makes sense. Jesse's always seemed different somehow. Karas nodded, his grin returning. Aye, he's different, all right. And just like you, he's more important to this mission than he realizes. Henrik stood, his gaze still fixed on the mountain. So, we go to Tantua then. But what happens when we get there? Karas rose beside him, tapping his staff lightly on the ground. That depends on the dwarves, but if I know Jesse, and I do, they'll listen. They'll have to. The world is changing, and even the mountains cannot remain untouched. The two of them set off once again, the path growing narrower and steeper as they ascended toward the heart of the mountain. As the shadows deepened and the jungle gave way to sheer rock, Henrik couldn't help but feel that something far greater was at play, a force pulling them toward Tantua, toward the dwarves, and toward whatever awaited them in the dark heart of the mountain. The path became steeper as they approached the sheer rock face. Henrik's muscles strained as he climbed, the weight of his sword and armor pulling at his every step. Karas moved more gracefully, his old frame belying his strength as he led the way. Finally, they reached a hidden crevice in the rock, barely noticeable unless one knew exactly where to look. Karas whispered an incantation, and the stone trembled before shifting to reveal a dark, narrow tunnel. Henrik's hand instinctively went to his sword. And this is the entrance? Karas grinned. Welcome to Tantua. The tunnel was damp and cold, the light from the surface fading quickly behind them. Henrik followed Karas through the winding passage, the faint glow of the wizard's staff illuminating the way. As they descended deeper into the mountain, the air became thicker, the weight of the earth pressing in around them. After what felt like hours of walking, the tunnel opened up into a vast cavern. Henrik's breath caught in his throat as he beheld the sight before him. Tantua, the fabled city of the Dwarves, lay sprawling within the heart of the mountain. Massive stone pillars rose from the ground to the cavern's ceiling, each carved with intricate runes and symbols. Dwarven forges belched fire and smoke in the distance, while tunnels and pathways crisscrossed the vast expanse, leading to the many levels of the city. The sound of hammers striking metal rang out like a distant drumbeat, and the faint glow of molten metal bathed the cavern in an eerie light. "By the gods," Henrik whispered. Karas smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "Now you see why the world envies the dwarves. Tantua is a fortress, a stronghold that no enemy has ever breached. But it's more than that. It's a living, breathing city." As they descended further into the city, Henrik took in every detail: the statues of ancient kings, the intricate carvings along the walls, the endless forges and workshops. Dwarves, short and stocky, moved about with purpose, their eyes sharp and wary as they glanced at Henrik, clearly unused to outsiders. Karas led him down a series of stone steps toward the heart of the mountain. Henrik couldn't help but notice that many of the dwarves wore helmets with strange symbols etched into them. As they passed a group of dwarves with hammers crossed over anvils on their helmets, Henrik's curiosity got the better of him. "Karas," Henrik began, nodding toward one of the dwarves. "What do those symbols on their helmets mean? I've been seeing different ones as we move through the city." Karas slowed his pace, glancing at the group of dwarves who were carrying crates of metal ingots toward one of the forges. "Ah, yes, the symbols. They indicate which floor and section of Tantua they belong to. Each level of the city serves a different purpose. The hammer and anvil you see represent the blacksmith's guild. They're among the finest in the world." Henrik's gaze shifted to another dwarf passing by, his helmet marked with a quill and an open book. "And that one?" Karas smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "A scholar. Those who spend their lives recording history, preserving knowledge, and advising the Ten." They walked deeper, and Henrik noticed other symbols. Some dwarves had axes crossed over shields, while others bore symbols of a pickaxe and shovel. The axes represent the warriors, those who defend Tantua and train for battle, Karas explained, and the pickaxe and shovel belong to the miners. They're the lifeblood of this city, constantly digging deeper into the mountain to provide materials for the forges. As they continued down the winding paths, Henrik found himself growing more intrigued by the sheer complexity of the dwarven society. "It's like a whole world in here," Henrik mused aloud. "Indeed," Karas said, "the dwarves have built a self-sustaining kingdom, and though they seem distant, they take pride in their work." Just then, a young dwarf with a braided beard and a helmet, bearing a sickle and a bushel of wheat, approached them. He was hauling a cart filled with fresh produce. "First time seeing Tantua, human?" the dwarf asked, eyeing Henrik with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Henrik nodded. "It's impressive. I've never seen anything like it." The dwarf grunted in approval. "You're lucky. Most outsiders don't get this deep into the mountain." Karas chuckled softly, placing a hand on Henrik's shoulder. "He's with me, and he's here on important business." The dwarf nodded, clearly respecting Karas's authority. "Well, you'll find no place like Tantua. We may be hidden from the world, but everything we need is right here." Henrik smiled. It seems so. As the dwarf wheeled his cart away, Henrik turned to Karas. Do all the dwarves live within these walls? For the most part, yes, Karas replied. The city is vast and it stretches deep into the mountain. Some of the miners and warriors spend time outside the mountain on occasion, but most dwarves prefer to stay within the safety of these walls. They passed through an arched tunnel that opened up into a vast chamber where a massive forge roared with heat and fire. The clanging of hammers on metal echoed through the air as dozens of blacksmiths worked tirelessly. Their helmets, adorned with the crossed hammer and anvil, gleamed in the firelight. Henrik could feel the intense heat as they walked by, and he marveled at the sheer skill and precision of the dwarves at work. As they moved on, they passed several dwarves, some nodding to Karas in recognition, others whispering as they noticed Henrik's presence. One particularly burly dwarf with an axe symbol on his helmet stopped in front of them, his arms crossed. Karas, the dwarf rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. What brings you back to Tantua? Karas gave a slight bow. Business with the One, Garvin, and this here is Henrik of Kipt. He's seeking an audience with Deganger. Garvin's eyes narrowed as he looked Henrik up and down. Kipt, eh? It's been a while since we've had dealings with your kind. Henrik straightened his back, meeting the dwarf's gaze. I'm here to request aid. My kingdom is under threat from the unkind. Garvin grunted, his expression hardening. That's for the One to decide, but know this, human. Dwarves don't forget easily. We remember who stood by us in times of need, and who didn't. Henrik's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Karas placed a hand on his arm. Let's not dwell on old wounds, Garvin. There are greater dangers ahead. The dwarf stared at Henrik for a moment longer before nodding curtly. Just remember, human, words carry weight down here. With that, Garvin stepped aside, allowing them to pass. Henrik let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. As they continued further into the mountain, the atmosphere grew more solemn. The weight of the dwarves' history, their culture, and their hidden world pressed down on Henrik's shoulders. They had finally arrived at the heart of Tantua. The chamber doors loomed before them, towering and engraved with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with ancient power. Karas reached out and whispered a few words, causing the doors to groan open slowly, revealing the vast council room inside. Henrik's breath caught as he took in the sight. The chamber was grander than anything he had ever seen, with high ceilings that sparkled with embedded gemstones, reflecting the light from the many braziers lining the walls. Dwarves, adorned in finely crafted armor and carrying the weight of centuries of knowledge, stood before them, their expressions stern and watchful. At the center sat Deganger, the dwarf king, flanked by the leaders of the 10, each of them masters in their field, representing the great factions of the dwarves. This, Karas whispered to Henrik, is where the real decisions are made. Henrik stepped forward, heart pounding. He knew what was at stake, and now it was time to plead his case.